say my stuff. Okay, we are live. It's the Senate Transportation Committee. We're continuing our discussion this morning with the agency's overview of our revenue and budget for 25 and 27. Thank you. Good morning. You are Bradley, right?
Yes.
Yes.
Good morning, Senator Mazza. For the record, I'm Bradley Kuchenberger. I'm the Chief Financial Officer for the Agency of Transportation. And this morning, I'd like to talk or begin the discussion of our revenue and budget pressures from 25 through 27. Trying to get my, there we go. For today's packet, which I have shared with you, I'm hoping to demonstrate our agency's non-federal match gap for the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, which extends through fiscal year 26. Review the governor's recommended plan to reduce that match gap, and finally summarize the agency's preliminary plan to utilize discretionary grant and other competitive programs in the IIJA. So in preparation for our budget build in fiscal year 24, we wanted to isolate the state match requirement and the state match available for the programs offered in the Infrastructure Improvement and Jobs Act, or the FAST Act reauthorization that runs through fiscal year 26. The committee's asked for some information through fiscal year 27, which on the screen and the chart on the screen all the way to the right, there is 27, but I've graded out because we do have to make some assumptions given that there is an authorization through that fiscal year, which we can cover in a moment. But primarily we wanted to look at what our total need is for matching in the first three lines, which would be considered the core programs of the Infrastructure Improvement and Jobs Act. There's the normal highway grants that we receive from FHWA that we've received for years at their actual apportioned level. The second line is the general fund bridge program, which the secretary alluded to is in total 225 million that comes to the state for bridges, and they have specific requirement for those bridges. That is funded through the federal general fund as opposed to the core highway programs, which are funded through the Highway Trust Fund. And lastly, and what I'm considering the core IIJA programs is the General Fund Electric Vehicle Program, also known as the NEVI program, which we have incorporated into our fiscal year budget. Below that first subtotal is the other discretionary and competitive grant opportunities that we have available to Vermont through the IIJA. And you see in fiscal year 24, we haven't availed ourselves to many of those competitive or discretionary grants, just a small portion for congressional earmarks. And the reason for that is when the IIJA passed, it had funding for many discretionary and competitive grant programs, but the FHWA needs to take, or whatever the organization that regulates that that funding, rail or air in some cases, needs to come up with the guidance for eligibility and the determination of that. And for many of these grants, we've received the final notice of guidance and eligibility just a few months ago. So we've really planned for fiscal year 25 and 26 to avail ourselves of some of those programs.
Well, maybe materials and stuff, inflation will not be quite as great in those outer years.
That is a hope for sure, because then we could get more material and bang for the buck. Exactly. So of those programs that we're looking at, public transit has a directed funded portion in the IIJA. It's more or less a guaranteed commitment that we'll be able to take advantage of in the future. That's the first line. The next two are competitive programs. One is the infra and the other is the bridge competitive program. And those both have minimums for all states. So all states will receive at least $50 million, either for one or up to two projects, which the project details, which we're planning on submitting for those are at the end of the presentation. There are some provisions for congressional earmarks, which we've accounted for, and finally, rail and airport competitive grant programs. I should note that the rail and airport, the way we fund rail and aviation in the state, they're always competitive grants. You know, all the federal dollars we're receiving from FRA or FAA is competitive in some nature. These dollars that we're showing for the Infrastructure Improvement and Jobs Act are in addition to those. And we're going to be seeking them in the coming years.
Is there a difference between funding that comes for private airports versus state airports? Are there different pots of money that, you know, we're all state we own our airports and all of that, but is there an advantage to privatizing these? You hear about that all the time. We ought to privatize it. We ought to do this. We ought to do that. Is there different ways of funding?
I defer that question.
One reality of ever privatizing something is repaying the Federal Aviation Administration for all the money that's ever been granted to that airfield.
That's good, the shocker. I found that out.
That's the poison pill.
Yeah,
Now, FAA, we've never had to do that, obviously, but FAA does have a record of allowing, so instead of just clawing back X number of dollars and giving it to Washington, they have a record of allowing a state to use those dollars to further aviation. Let's say if you didn't do all airports, but in other words, you can't.
At the end of the day, it's trying to liquidate one way or the other. You're right. Okay, thank
So
you.
that's just one aspect to the reality of that
You
question.
cured me.
Yes,
Or is the congressional earmarks, or as they like to call them, congressionally directed spending, are those those have already happened, or are you just assuming there's going to be something around 5 million?
Those are more or less known at this point that that amount of funds is sort of baked in for congressionally directed spending to Vermont. We have not received notification of where exactly those will go at this point in time, but we know that they will be coming and that there is a match component to those at this time.
And you have a say in?
We do work with the congressional district or congressional delegation, excuse me, on how and where, to the extent that they take our input, I cannot say.
So it didn't specify, like in one piece of legislation, we had I don't know how many pages of specific earmarks that Senator Sanders had gotten included, and they were very specific to a particular town, a particular building, et cetera.
Right.
What you're saying is this is not
So
quite
in,
as specific as
yeah,
the earmarks that we've experienced.
yeah, we do have those projects programmed. I'm forgetting exactly which ones they are at the top of my head. I believe they're 108 Cherry Street is a bus, a public transit expansion. And then I believe there's another one related to rail, but I'd have to get back to you on that specifics.
Well, we did receive an earmark, the work I was talking about that's going to be done at the White River Junction platform. That was Senator Sanders earmark. He's earmarked some money for the Missisquoi Valley Rail Trail. Senator Leahy earmarked money for the 1,000-foot extension that I mentioned for the Highgate, which will come in calendar 24. I think Bradley's point is that as Congress starts to ruminate about what they're going to allocate for congressionally directed spending, we do hear from the delegation. They ask us, are there projects out there you'd like us to throw into the hopper? But we don't know until they tell us. You know, Representative at the time, Welch, now Senator Welch, had an earmark for the intersection of Quarry Hill Road and I guess that's Route 14 right there in Barry to rebuild that intersection. There's an example. So when they make the decision, it's specific. But on the front end of making the decision, they just take a lot of input from us.
So is it 5 million that we definitely have? We just don't know for what?
That's the guidance that we've been looking at since the passage of the IIJA.
Rail competitive grants, then that could mean you get them or you might not then.
Right. So we have two proposals, two proposed bundles of projects for rail to take advantage of these competitive grants, which I'll get to in a moment. In summary on this slide, though, we wanted to really isolate the state match required to fund all of these initiatives. And we took that in comparison to the state match dollars we have available, taking into consideration all the other pressures throughout the agency.
And that's what gets you to the 78 that you were talking about, 33, 34,
Yeah.
10.
And so the bottom line is the general fund investment in the FY24 governor's recommended budget that equals $79 million in change.
I wasn't going to harp on this again, but since you highlighted it, I just want to state I have concerns about taking that money from the general fund when this is for the transportation fund, and it just seems that we should either find money in the existing transportation budget or look at modestly increasing the fees, and that's just where I currently am. Persuade me otherwise, but that's just where my mind is on that topic.
May I just recall too, though, that every year the legislature takes $20,250,000 from the transportation fund to supplement the Department of Public Safety. And we made a proposal to stop doing that, but the legislature didn't want to put that burden on the general fund. So I just acknowledge what you're saying, but there's still another $20,250,000 in the transportation fund that we're not able to use every year.
Senator Kitchell, wasn't that there, what was the history on that?
Well, originally it was a lot more than we brought it down, and the estimate is that if you were to look at the cost of highway safety and law enforcement on highways, that would probably be about 15 as opposed to the 20. So that's the big difference as opposed to all or nothing. Now, as Senator Maas will bring out, is that JTOC transfer is how we protect the police fleet. Because that's, we said out of that transfer, a certain amount had to be spent to keep
2.5 million, 2.4
to keep the fleet
updated, like we
updated,
do the
because
dump truck.
they were, holding together the police force with bungee cords, and
Sure.
they could only fill the gas tanks half full because they leak. So it was a way of saying, you've got the money, you can't continue to, what they were doing is funding other things that they wanted and not investing in the replacement of their fleet. And then they would come and say, look how bad it is. And so it was a way of assuring that that would be invested. So that's, it used to be many, many more uses of the T fund, and that got eliminated over time. It was called raiding the fund. So in some ways, some of what we're doing now would probably fall under raiding the fund. For example, your public transit and providing the services to get people to methadone. So it depends on how pure you want to be and what's transportation. And it got into that big debate, but there's only one transfer now as opposed to many years ago. It was a lot more. But of course, the revenues were much more robust at that point. So we had a very different fiscal environment. But that's where the JTOC transfer came in, and we have a JTOC committee, but we don't meet very often. So,
Secretary, that's still the administration's position, even though you didn't put that in the budget, that's and the JTOC transfer.
I've heard nothing to the contrary, Senator Perch. Like, you're right. It's not a proposition that was advanced this year because it was not supported when it was advanced. I think it was last year. And I was at Public Safety and was Deputy Commissioner, so I appreciate everything Senator Mitchell's talking about the history there. I also appreciate that they need to know, they need to have assurances that they have the money to upgrade their fleet on an annual basis. I remember one year, in House appropriations, we were scrambling to try to pay $100,000 gas bill. So I totally appreciate needing predictability. I only made the comment, and I don't mean to be argumentative about transparency, but I just wanted to reiterate though that, that transfer is T-fund money, and we're talking about ways to make the match. And the conversation was around, is it really transparent to use general fund to make the match? I just wanted to put it back on the table that there is T-fund money, but it has previously been directed to other uses as well. And
I suppose we could argue the same is true for the purchase and use, a third of which goes to the end fund.
Right. Yeah, I was going to bring that up
Yeah.
in a similar line of thinking of,
Yeah,
it's.
yeah, you pull that out and it'll be made up by property taxes, so that'll be very.
Right.
Right, a lot of trading back and forth.
But,
What pocket do you want to pick?
Exactly right, what bucket?
and I guess my last comment to your question, Senator Person, would be the annual replacement cost of the fleet for the state police would never be anything that we would object to. But we don't object to JTOC. That's what legislation decided. But there's a distance between 3 million a year and 20 million. 250.
We also did it on the equipment for the highway equipment every 8 years, I guess we.
Right.
Oh, central garage.
Right.
And that's what
We don't
that's
want people driving unsafe
Right,
equipment,
right.
and they're out there, like police are out there driving 100 miles an hour or whatever it is, or
Right.
the cars are deteriorating, but like trucks, we want good, and you get a resale value better.
you do. There's like a sweet spot,
Right.
for engine hours and mileage. By that, I mean, the salvage value when it goes to auction,
And repairs.
and then the increasing cost of repairs if you postpone that cycle. So it's, those are all very, pressing realities, of course.
I don't think you're ever gonna see the prices come down from where they are today.
What's that, the new base?
Well, yeah, I think people think that contractors' prices are gonna come down. No, because if you increase your salaries, you don't take salaries back once you give them the first salary. As far as, the diesel fuel and all this other stuff and overall expenses, nothing's gonna drop down in prices. It's set there today. That's the base now. And like I said, in my store, I see prices in bread and stuff that's high. You're not gonna see that come down because they're fixed now. The overhead is fixed.
Maybe eggs, we could see that.
Well, no, sure, that's a disease that caused that. Eggs will be back, like turkeys last year. Turkeys, they were down millions of turkeys nationwide because of the disease. But normally that will be back up to level again. But as far as infrastructure or
Or wage rate.
wages, you're not gonna say to a person, I give you $5 raise this year, I'm taking it back next year, what's gonna happen there? So, Yeah, that's not gonna happen.
So we used a similar logic when I was looking into what would 2027 look like, even though we don't have an authorization bill yet. If we look at the history of the FAST Act reauthorization, once there's been an increase in the core programs, if you will, it has never decreased since then. So I think it's safe to assume if we look at 27, the core highway programs could stay at their higher level. It's the general fund bridge program that would be up in the air on whether that would be rolled into a new FAST Act reauthorization or not. But for now, I've considered it in 27 not to be a portion of the program.
New guy question, I'm gonna steal Tom's line, FAST Act. What was FAST Act?
The FAST Act is the
It sounds duplicitous, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Oh,
It's-
sneaky, the
Yeah.
fast act.
It's the service and transportation bill, and it was given similar names over and over again. And so now it's referred to as the FAST Act, and it's the way that,
Fixing the F and then what's the acronym stand?
I forget the F.
Fixing or
I gotta Google it, but
That's fine.
Fixing American surface transportation.
But yeah, so it's colloquially referred to as the FAST Act, but really it's the federal reauthorization that sends us our apportionments.
I just want to make sure it wasn't something that we had appropriated and I was like, oh, I should know that.
This is a visual representation of, similar to the secretary's presentation, where you see a portion that's, there's a gap and there's general fund proposal to mitigate that funding gap in 25, 26, and 24. Here's the specific language that will be in the appropriations bill. I'm not sure to the extent you've received that yet, but that's what it'll look like. So it'll say 24, there'll be a transfer into the transportation fund of $10.9 million. And then in section D of that same section D 101, it'll say 68 million and change will be reserved for a general fund transfer to the T fund in fiscal years 25 and 26 as necessary. Lastly, this is my last slide. I wanted to show the preliminary plan for investing or applying for competitive grants that are offered through the IIJA. And there's a few factors that we considered when coming up with this preliminary list. One is, would a specific project be eligible? Would the eligible project be within the time frame that we need it to be? And would that mixture of eligibility and the project that we're seeking be likely to be funded and compete well against other states and other projects? And so this is the preliminary list we have. The first line shows it's also an accounting of the full $79 million that the governor has recommended from the general fund to the transportation fund. The first portion of that would cover just our general formula funding. So it's $32.6 million for an estimated return of 163.1. The next.
So let me ask, those formula funds, those are normally our ongoing funding streams.
Correct.
So we basically are not able to generate an ongoing match to support at the end of, say, 26, where that set aside, where it comes from, is exhausted. Then we've got that gap then for future fiscal years.
Right. If the next authorization were to occur at a similar level, we'd be in a gap situation, quite a significant one. In fact, the roughly $32 million one.
Yeah. Okay.
Um,
Can you explain this chart again?
Yeah, so we're looking at this first line. I don't know if my things here. So we're looking at this first line and saying, for a general fund investment of $79 million, what do we get? And the first is the match to pull down our core program apportionments through the next 3 fiscal years. So that's a portion of it.
And what I was differentiating is
Yeah.
between those federal funds that are ongoing and are normally there, and those that are this short-term infusion because of the IIJA legislation, which then ends in 26. So we've got a combination of both there.
Yeah.
And so if we need more match to just do what we would normally do through our formula grants, we've got a gap. And
Right.
that, which is obvious when you look at the revenues into the T fund.
And costs going up and revenue going down, you're gonna have a gap for the, so these were just taking that 79 million and letting us know specifically which projects.
Yes.
Correct. And so the following projects below the first line are the competitive and discretionary grant programs that were in the IIJA that we're seeking to apply for and hopefully receive. So the first comes from the rail improvement grant
Washington
program.
County Rail, look at that.
So that we've proposed
What's the
either
name of the
and both the rail programs we've listed here are bundles of projects. So it'd either be a Western Corridor track replacement or the Washington County Railroad, each of which will cost quite a bit of money, and we'd receive $50 million for a $10 million investment there. The following two are related to what's called the Competitive Bridge Program under this authorization. And that's those two put together. Again, these are the minimum Vermont could receive. So those are the two projects we're seeking to put forth.
Would the Queechee Bridge be the Queechee Gorge bridge?
Correct. It's that,
Boy, that's quite a bridge.
it is.
We did something a couple of years ago with that.
We
but
did
it's
the,
Safety rail. That's right.
Yeah, the netting.
Yeah, that's right.
To,
To stop
because of the,
suicides.
yeah.
And the other one in the competitive bridge program we'd be seeking is the Reedsboro State Bridge. The last line in this kind of first package of green ones is public transit. So these are at the top of the list because we know the funding will be there and all of these projects meet those eligibility requirements. The next set are still highly likely, yes. Please.
So for public transit, is it just supporting the current public transit, or does it have to be a new project, like we're gonna do a new line or buy a new bus?
It could be supporting the existing work that we do, just in a greater proportion. Or a new project. I would leave that to the
So
program
that
to
could
speak to.
potentially be doing one way, building a base.
Washington County
Right.
Rail.
No, I'm talking for public transit.
To be clear, the Washington County, all 50 million should be spent in Washington County, but
Yeah,
it's
right. They're getting
just
enough
the name
now.
of the railroad.
I like it. Washington County.
The second set are the next four projects. These are still, we consider highly likely that we be very competitive for, but less so than the first set. And so there's a Springfield Interstate project, which we'd go for an infra grant, and that's a paving project. Another paving project is the Orwell Addison, which could either be a RAISE grant or an infra grant. Those are just two different programs that we might be able to compete for. We might apply for both and see which one we get. And the last two are both RAISE and infra grants, a Pittsburgh Brandon roadway project and a Chester Bridge. The last one is highly, we will receive this grant if we apply for it, but we have yet to specify the specific areas in which we put it, so that's what's at the bottom of the list.
So in simplicity, for $79 million, we can receive 420 million and a half back.
Correct. So that,
Pretty good investment, like, I like
Yeah.
that for that, for the guy, yeah.
It's like 72% back for the monies that you
Eagles
go.
wants to invest in there.
Yeah.
So your big problem is your top line, long-term.
Right.
that is correct. If we go back and say, for example, if we look at estimate into 27, if we take out all of the extras that were included in the IIJA, so the general fund bridge program, and then all these competitive grant programs, if we look at the consensus revenue outlook, we're in a deficit scenario, and I don't think it's unlikely that some additional funds like the general fund bridge program would be included in another reauthorization, which would put us in a further gap scenario with our current funding. But the governor's proposal from 24 through 26 would meet our needs and be able to draw down, like you pointed out, $420 million. So that is the extent of my presentation today. I'm happy to answer more questions, or if you think of other ways you want to consider or discuss this topic, we're happy to work with our counterpart at JFO to get you whatever you need to help this discussion along.
Do you guys, do you guys have your own grant people within?
Yes.
Yeah, and every agency has their own grant people?
I can't speak for every agency, but AOT does have a grants unit, and we assist the programs who will actually implement the grant. And I think they have some expertise as well.
I can imagine too that we're seeing the grants here, and these are the ones that you have found value with for the state of Vermont, but there's probably all kinds of other stuff that you say, we just don't have a value to where we think we want to spend the match money to go after that type.
Yeah, so we're constrained not just by funds, but also our mix of projects that we have available and ready to go. So let's take rail as an example. We have the secretary in the budget presentation discussed the build grant. We applied and received that grant, and in doing so, we're obligated to complete the work associated with that grant. So we take it very seriously, whether or not we will be able to
Right, so
complete
you're not
that
just
work.
putting bids out there to see what you can get. I
Right,
mean, you have to
so
meet-
you have to consider what we as an agency would be able to deliver in the requisite time frame. Because if you accept a grant, you're obligated to do the work, and if you don't get it done within the right time frame, you are still obligated to do the work. You just may not have the funding to do it.
Any questions? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Very good.
Chris, you have anything to add?
No, Mr. Chair.
Okay.
Go Eagles.
Birds.
Yeah. They're getting close.
Okay.
Do they win?
Yeah. We got, what, one more game and then,